All right, shall I get started?
Wait a minute. We are still waiting for the attendees. So maybe I will play the video.
All right, shall I get started?
Wait a minute. We are still waiting for the attendees. So maybe I will play the video.
Video ini membahas bagaimana asuransi kerja dan kebijakan pasar tenaga kerja aktif membantu para penganggur.
Alright,
Sebelum mulai, mari
get
kita
started?
lihat tantangan-tantangan dalam bidang ketenaga kerjaan dan bagaimana hal tersebut berdampak pada kita. Banyak dari kita memerlukan pendapatan tetap dari pekerjaan untuk melangsungkan hidup dan memenuhi kebutuhan keluarga. Dengan pendapatan tersebut, kita bisa mendapat hidup layak, termasuk rumah, makanan, pakaian, sekolah anak, dan lainnya. Video ini membahas bagaimana asuransi kerja, bagaimana jika tiba-tiba kita tenaga kerja aktif membantu para mungkin akan terjadi krisis sebelum mulai, dan mari kita lihat tantangan dalam bidang ketenaga kerjaan dan bagaimana hal tersebut berdampak pada kita.
Okay, so I think we are having some technical issues. Okay, but let us just start the session while waiting for probably more participants will probably come as we go. Okay. We relatively have a small group of participants today, but probably our colleagues could allow them to enter whenever they access to the Zoom, while also we broadcast the live on the ILO YouTube channel. Let us just start the session. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Again. On this Zoom call. My name is Ipet Suruga, as you may know, the Social Protection Program Manager of the ILO Jakarta office, covering Indonesia, certainly. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the ILO Jakarta Social Protection lecture series, as usual. The SPLs, we call it SPLs, lecture series hosted by the ILO Jakarta office, Social Protection Program team, and financially supported by the fast retailing and the government of Japan. And we try to organize one lecture every month at the end of every month. The lecture series primarily provides experts who work on social protection issues and neighboring important agenda or issues in Indonesia, or those who work for Indonesia primarily. But we don't exclude other participants or audience from other parts of the world to take an advantage of this technology conference call system. And so our topic today, as you know, is social protection and climate change. As you know, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, was held in Glasgow and until November 12, if I remember correctly. And we thought this would be a good timing for us to explore this topic, social protection and climate change, in the lecture today, the lecture of this month. And speakers today will discuss what role social protection can play to protect people against ongoing and future impacts of, mostly negative impacts of climate change, and what approaches and strategies exist across the world. So we have Christina today on this call, who are social protection and climate change specialists at the ILO Social Protection Department. And Christina previously worked with the UNICEF as well in the Eastern Caribbean region, where she coordinated the United Nations Joint Program on Adaptive Social Protection. She also worked with BMZ GAZ of the government of Germany, based in Cambodia and the Philippines, and also worked with FAO and WHO. We also have a Camila Roman, policy specialist in the ILO Green Jobs program, of course, who is an expert in the area of climate change and the green job in the ILO. She coordinates technical assistance on a just transition towards sustainable economies, the development of policy tools, and the implementation of related projects. And she previously also worked for the ILO Better Work Cambodia, and also worked in Thailand, Philippines, and India in this region. So as usual, during this seminar, feel free to post any questions on the chat box, either in Indonesian language or English. And you also have an interpretation functions by pressing Indonesian language or English. And this lecture is, as usual, on live on the ILO YouTube channel, and the recordings will be immediately available on the YouTube channel, and we will also post it on the ILO website. So welcome you all again to the sixth lecture series in this year, and the floor is yours, Christina. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ipe, and good afternoon to those of you joining from Indonesia, and good morning from my side in Geneva, Switzerland. It's my pleasure to take you through today's lecture on social protection and climate change. I have invited my colleague Camilla from the Green Jobs program, who I will ask at various points throughout the lecture to bring in the employment perspective and talk a little bit about the concept of just transition and the respective guidelines on this. as this is a concept of significant importance for today's topic. Just to check if we can switch the slides to presentation mode as well, and maybe go to the overview for today's lecture. Thank you so much. So just to start off, I will provide a very brief introduction on the topic why social protection and climate change before I hand over to Camilla for an introduction to the concept of just transition, implications for jobs and productivity. And then I will continue with social protection and climate change, also the ILO's approach on this. We'll take a quick break with a few discussion questions in the meantime, before we go over to country examples, look a little bit at the regional context and challenges, and specifically Indonesia. And as an outlook, we also have a few points on the latest COP26 agreements from the conference in Glasgow. All right, so to start off today's lecture, I wanted to start with a slide with 5 different pictures. Take a look at these. They all depict different aspects of how social protection and climate change interrelate. And the first thing we see is the immediate climate change impacts today. So social protection can actually protect people in the case of sudden onset events. And we'll look at how exactly this works in a bit more detail later. The second thing you see, there are also slow onset impacts of climate change. So for example, soil erosion, sea level rise, changes in precipitation. And social protection can help people prepare for future impacts of climate change that we will see in more frequency and severity, and also help people adapt their income sources in terms of their livelihoods, their diversification of income sources, and also help prevent or transfer the remaining risk that people still have to the extent possible. One concept that I just wanted to, one term that I wanted to introduce is climate change adaptation. So these two relate to adaptation, which is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate effects and impacts. And in the third picture, we see also the potential contributions to climate change mitigation, which refers to human interventions that reduce emissions or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. Sinks sounds complicated, but essentially just refers to reducing or avoiding emissions or capturing and storing carbon in soil, for example, or also biomass, for example, trees. And social protection programs can help with this in terms of, here you see the example of a public employment program in terms of natural resource management, and have quite some transformative potential. And we'll look at that in detail later as well. And then in the fourth picture, we would also see some negative impacts of the transition to a low carbon economy in society. And there is quite a significant urgency to mitigate the economic and social disruptiveness of decarbonization. And finally, we can also actively promote a just transition with a focus on links between social protection and employment, active labor market policies. And on this last point, I'll hand over to Camilla, who will elaborate a little bit more on jobs and climate change implications and introduce the concept of just transition as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Christina. And allow me to also say that I'm delighted to be back with colleagues in Asia, as I was based in the Asia Pacific region for some time. And in fact, my earlier project was under the ILO Japan. So great to be with you today. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why the ILO is in the business of climate change in the first place, because that's something that we often get asked. And over the years, I've seen some changes inside and outside the organization, but it's sometimes not very clear why the ILO is engaging on environmental sustainability, climate change issues in the first place. And what I want to emphasize is that we don't work on climate change as such. We work at the intersection between decent work and climate change. And it's always very important to remind us this when we work with partners, when we design projects, because that's where our mandate resides, and that's where we have our best competitive advantage. So the reason why the ILO started to look at climate change and environmental issues in general, it's because the world of work and the natural environment are very deeply interconnected. We know from a global study that the ILO has carried out that more than 1.2 billion jobs globally are linked to healthy and well-functioning ecosystem services. These are the kind of basic services that the planet provides and where upon which our economic activities rely. It could be the services of water, providing water, drinking water, or water that we can use in production processes. It's about the absorption of greenhouse gas emissions that forests provide and allow us to have a stable, or right now not so stable, climate. But all of these services affect and the viability of many jobs and economic activities. The second point that is important to mention is that climate change is affecting and will affect employment and labor in general. We know that if the current trends continue in terms of global warming, by 2030, 2% of working hours will be lost to disasters and will pose occupational health and safety threats. We also know that if we act, there will be deep implications on labor markets. So we know that we need to act because, there is an existential threat to humanity right now linked to climate change. But also from an ILO perspective, we know it is important to take action on climate change because otherwise we will lose incomes, we will lose productivity, we will face OSH threats. But at the same time, the moment we do take actions, there will be very deep changes that will happen on the labor markets. On the first, let me give you the big good news. The good news is that we expect a net generation of employment by taking action on climate change globally. So we know that a net gain of 80 million jobs globally will be generated by taking action on energy, efficiency, renewable energy, and transport alone. So that's good news. At the same time, this doesn't mean that it's the only change that will happen in labor market. There will be some employment losses, especially in fossil fuel-based sectors. Let's think of coal mines and coal power plants. You know from the recent COP that there will be a phase down of coal in the years to come, and we can expect similar trends in the future also for other fossil fuels. This means that jobs that are dependent on fossil fuels will decline. The second type of change is that we will have some jobs that in the same sector will be substituted. So if we're talking about the waste management sector, we will see a change from incineration to recycling, for example. And it's not, let's say, a smooth transition necessarily, right? It's not that for one day you work in an incinerator and tomorrow you're gonna work on recycling. There are some structural adjustments that need to happen. The third type of change is that many jobs will change in the way they work. We will use different processes, we'll use different technologies. And finally, of course, there will be new job opportunities that will be created and are there to be leveraged in the future and in the near future and in the longer term. So if we move on to the next slide, the logic of an ILO approach to dealing with all of this is that as we shift to carbon neutrality, as we shift to sustainability, we need to maximize the positive economic and employment impacts that we have from the transition. We need to maximize the job opportunities. We need to increase the chance that there are ways to upgrade them and improve the quality of the jobs that are there. But at the same time, we need to understand what potential negative impacts might be and to address them. And that's obviously a clear place where social protection is key. So when we talk about this restructuring that is happening, about workers losing jobs in certain sectors, or where we have other elements of substitution, Obviously, social protection is key to make sure that that transition in the lifetime of a worker is fair. And finally, we want to make sure that the vulnerable are protected and included. And again, here social protection is really key because it's about ensuring that when we talk about climate change adaptation and resilience, we are really addressing the intersections between different types of vulnerability, climate vulnerability, but also social vulnerabilities and different types of disadvantages. So if we then go to the next slide, we go to the whole point of the just transition guidelines. So the just transition guidelines are all about that. So a just transition about maximizing the positive decent work opportunities and minimizing negative impacts. But how do we go about it? And that's why in 2015, governments, employers, and worker representatives came together to develop these guidelines. The guidelines are about providing principles and entry points to constituents around the world to bring about a just transition depending on their national circumstances. They cut across a range of policy areas that go from microeconomic policies to employment, including active labor markets, skills development, enterprises, and labor protection. And this obviously relies on occupational health and safety and social protection, which is the subject of the lecture today. They're underpinned by rights and labor standards. And critical to this is to ensure policy coherence around all these fields. What we will see today is the two policy fields that we keep on moving across. On the one hand is climate action, is environmental policies. On the other hand is social policies, social protection, labor market policies. So how can we make sure that they don't go into different directions, but we are taking into account the environmental policies, take into account social issues, and social protection policies take into account environmental ones. And finally, let me just end with the underlying importance of social dialogue in all of this, as obviously with any ILO approach, with the type of policies that we develop need to be grounded in social dialogue at the national, sectoral, and enterprise level to come up with the type of solutions that are relevant to local circumstances and take into account the tripartite perspectives. So with that, I will hand it over to Christina to go deeper into the social protection elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And if we can go to the next slide, what we have done here is focus a little bit more on the different sort of pathways that we can take when looking at the interrelation between social protection and climate change. First of all, and this is my first key message for today, social protection in its core functions already provides protection against climate-related risks because it already aims to actually protect people throughout the life cycle over the course of their lives, making sure to address poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. And so if we look at the different instruments, social assistance, social insurance, and also linked to that active labor market policies, we do see that role throughout. So as an example here, we can reduce household debt and people can invest more in their livelihoods, diversify, and make sure they're more resilient, whatever the future may bring. But because climate change increases the risks we face over the course of our lives, there are a few considerations we may want to take into account when formulating, planning, implementing the different policies Camilla just mentioned, strategies, the different plans and programs as well. So first of all, when we look at climate change adaptation, there are different elements to this. So first of all, we see these sudden onset events, disasters, where social protection can actually directly support disaster risk management and vice versa. So when we look at the overall disaster risk management cycle and the 5 different phases, just before and just after a shock, we have preparedness and we have response. So this is where social protection programs can actually come in, be scaled up, and help support people who are affected by a shock. But even beyond that, if we start earlier with the prevention and the risk transfer, we can actually use certain elements of social protection to help people deal with it in advance and try and prepare the best they can, and also afterwards in the recovery phase. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that as well shortly. But also when we look at adaptation, we need to figure out how to actually enable people to adapt their livelihoods so that they're not quite so vulnerable, especially people who live in areas, in coastal areas, for example, that are a lot more vulnerable too, or those who live below the poverty line, for example, who simply don't have the means to adequately equip and prepare themselves to be able to cope with climate change related impacts. And so here we can also look at, for example, national adaptation plans on the green policy side as entry points, and also the nationally determined contributions, so essentially countries' commitments to the Paris Agreement, where we can actually insert social protection programming considerations as well. But we also know, and this is another really important message, adaptation will not be enough to counteract the impacts on poverty and food security. We see that some root causes of people's vulnerability can actually be tackled by land and water management, managing natural resources more sustainably, but also helping capture and store carbon. And social protection can directly contribute. We already mentioned the example of a public employment program. So you can put people to work, but at the same time also link that to training so that people actually know how to better manage these natural resources, how to reforest, for example, how to manage water resources and avoid soil erosion. So those are very important linkages in practice between the two areas. And then finally, on the last point, just transition, I won't go into too much detail now because Camilla already mentioned it right now, but we can actually also look at national just transition plans to actually link social policies and green policies in a bit more detail, and also in terms of implementation. We can look at employment active labor market policies to also forge a really strong link between social protection and so, for example, unemployment protection and training and reskilling, etc., so that when people are out of a job through the transition, they are supported, but at the same time, they're also enabled to then re-enter the labor market with a different job, for example. So now moving on to ILO's approach on social protection and climate change. You can see here, so this has been formulated under the ILO's Social Protection for Flagship Program, which recently started with its second phase from 2021 to 24, and is structured around these three areas, specifically in the thematic area of social protection and climate change. So we see adaptation, mitigation, and then also working towards a universal social protection system more broadly. And let me explain to you why we structured it that way to begin with. So first of all, in terms of the contribution to climate change adaptation, we already mentioned the role to protect from current and future impacts of climate change. I mentioned disaster risk management, but when we also look at insurance elements, so social insurance, for example, this is often an instrument that is underused and rarely considered to actually transfer people's risk. And so when we look at the example of health insurance, so social health protection, for example, it is really important for people whenever they face additional disasters, additional risks in their lives, to actually have that basic coverage, because they may, face additional health issues given a disaster, also given longer term changes in the environment. For example, in the short term, they may face injuries, but they may also have, lung issues going forward, etc. And so social insurance is actually a really important element as part of adaptation efforts as well. And then we see, first of all, I already mentioned both sudden onset and slow onset events that can be tackled. And in terms of slow onset, I already mentioned those are longer term changes in the environment because of climate change. And people actually often, and we see that even in countries that are highly urbanized, we see that people really still depend on natural resources, and that makes certain areas vulnerable, but also the population as a whole, if those resources are compromised, not managed well, etc. And we see additional shocks. And so what can also be done in terms of adaptation is actually including supporting more resilient behaviors, not just more resilient sources of income, but also the way people treat their natural resources, for example, nature-based solutions, etc. And so for the second column, we already mentioned a few examples for mitigation as well. But I mean, one element certainly is to contribute to the rehabilitation, restoration of landscapes and coasts, also looking at reforestation and conservation in social protection programs and helping to capture and store greenhouse gases. And in that sense, we'll look at an example as well later, so I won't go into more detail here. But the second big element is as people move to lower carbon jobs and industries, workers need to be supported and their communities as well throughout the transition process, as we mentioned before. But throughout all of this, it's really important, and this is another key message for today, without social protection that is increasingly universal, so we try to reach as many people as possible, green policies, both climate change mitigation and adaptation, will leave some people behind, and they won't be politically, socially acceptable, and therefore not sustainable. And we've seen this in a few countries, including in France recently with the Yellow Vest movement, that the green measures implemented were just not politically and socially accepted by many people. And so also when we look at it the other way around from a social protection perspective, universal social protection, so to really reach everyone in a society, will only be achieved if the now intensified life cycle risks that we see, so be it health or unemployment, etc., are covered, and these more rapid and frequent changes in needs due to a wider range of climate-related risks are also not just anticipated, but social protection systems can maintain their functionality throughout in good and in bad times, and also have financial sustainability. And that's really important to remember. So before we continue with a few examples and go into this in a bit more detail, we have two questions for you, and we'd like to just ask you to answer in the chat to the extent possible. I think we can't unmute people at this stage. We can go to the next slide. We prepared the questions there for you. So first of all, if you think the transition will, by default, bring positive social outcomes, and by the transition we mean to a low carbon economy and society, and then what you think the social implications of transitioning will actually be. And so the first question you can just answer in the chat, yes or no, and then if you want to type in a little bit more what your thoughts are on this, you can also certainly add them in whichever language we want, because I hear we have excellent translators with us as well. And Ipe, if you can keep an eye on it as well, and of course you can also answer if you want, because I'm sure you have an opinion on it. Can't see the chat, so Ipe, I'm relying on you to keep an eye on it and collect the responses, and otherwise, yeah, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, most likely the participants are quite too shy to post, or probably these topics may be quite new to everyone, and but we welcome any comments on the chat box, of course.
Then let me ask my colleague Camilla maybe as well, because I know she has an opinion on these questions, to just jump in maybe with the first question, and if you want to add a little bit on the second one, please feel free.
Thanks. Yeah, and just to say that there are complex issues, and in fact, there are no kind of right or wrong answers as such. So on the first question, there will be jobs that are generated. So that's, one could say that that's a positive social outcome. So if you have investment flowing into, let's say, renewable energy, there will be jobs that are created. So that could be considered, and I think can be considered, a good social outcome. At the same time, there are also a number of questions that we need to ask to figure out if the overall impact will be socially fair, will be positive in social terms. And there are a few things that we have to bear in mind. The first question we should ask is, the new jobs that are generated, will they be good jobs? You know, like how do they compare to the jobs that are being lost? Because if we have a situation where jobs are informal, if we have a situation where there are certain basic labor rights that are not respected, that's not necessarily a positive social outcome. So we need to make sure by design that the new job opportunities that are created are good jobs, are decent work. The second point I think that we have to bear in mind is that you can have green policies that have more or less socially positive outcomes. So maybe to bring it down to the social, something that is pretty relevant to social protection. For fossil fuel subsidies reform, you might know that around the world, and there are talks and there are moves about removing some subsidies that made electricity cheaper, in particularly fossil fuel-based electricity. Now, that can be very, let's say, can pose big social challenge for people that live in poverty, because they spend a lot of their income on energy. So if the electricity prices go up, the poor will be left worse off. So that's really something to bear in mind. So depending on how you design this kind of reforms, you will have positive or negative social outcomes. So in the case of fossil fuel subsidies reform, the saving that the governments have, the fiscal space that gets created by removing the subsidies, could be used for different things. If they are used for social programs, if they are used for a social transfer, then the negative impacts are mitigated or eliminated, because some say also that fossil fuel subsidies are benefiting more the rich and the poor, depending on how they are designed. So it's really about the way that green policies and complementary social policies are put together, and what kind of decisions making happens over there. And that's where I think the ILO and the constituents have an important role to play, to make sure that policies are shaped in environmental policies and additional policies are shaped in a way to deliver these positive outcomes.
Thanks. I'm happy to add. I'm just seeing there are a few comments in the chat now. Ipe, do you want to read them out real quick, and then I'll respond afterwards?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, yeah, I was just checking it. Okay, first comment was, it depends on how the transition happens. If it is planned and gradual, then it can bring positive outcomes. New jobs are localized and can be of good quality. If not, and it is forced or abrupt, which looks likely to be more the case, then the social outcomes will be more chaotic. Yeah, large increases in the unemployment and transition which won't be smooth. This is the first comment. And do you want me to go further?
Sure, yeah, I can just take the next one, which I would also agree with. So someone says, I would argue that it'll not bring positive outcomes by default, but that it takes quite some efforts to make this transition just and bring positive outcomes. So this will probably take some time before positive outcomes manifest. And I think what we do see is that certainly there are some positive outcomes in terms of, new job creation, as Camilla said. It also, is potentially better for people to engage in more sustainable livelihoods to begin with. But I think what we see is that oftentimes green policies tend to, kind of not necessarily consider the pretty severe consequences on parts of the population. As Camilla said, some of those who live below the poverty line. We also see that the transition isn't necessarily gender neutral. So sometimes women may also be more affected by these disruptions than men. We also see differences in terms of where jobs are being created. So sometimes the new jobs will not necessarily be created in areas where there are enough workers in that specific field. There's differences also in terms of the skills level that we have to address, for example, through training, etc. And we also see that net jobs sometimes hide these differences a little bit, right? So if you look at the overall number of jobs that is increased, we also see that there may be, some people who are left behind in the process. And that's kind of, the impetus for today's lecture. And then we also have another response here from a participant, yes to number one. So I would slightly disagree, but I think you can definitely say that there are some positive social outcomes. And the answer to the second question, complex implications, negative resistance to transition from coal/FF reliance, fossil fuels, I guess, higher energy cost could push people to poverty, and positive, the possibility of expanding social protection during the transition phase. Definitely agree with that one. Thank you so much for these contributions. So maybe we can move on now to the different examples. And obviously, if you have any additional comments or questions on these as well, let us know and we can discuss them in the Q&A afterwards. So we wanted to start with an example sort of from the region, from a neighboring country, which takes us back to the adaptation side. So first of all, as I said, existing social protection programs can actually just play a role in themselves to protect people. And so in the Philippines, we see existing social assistance programs. The 4 Ps is one example, which can also then be used to reach more people who are affected in case of a disaster, and it has been used for this purpose. In the Philippines, there are now also efforts to build people's resilience in advance of a shock, in any kind of disaster. So there are disaster preparedness knowledge and skills trainings, specifically looking at program participants who are, due to their limited means, by and large more vulnerable to shocks. But in the wake of the Typhoon Haiyan, as we all know, that was pretty devastating. We also had the example of the Integrated Livelihoods and Emergency Employment Program, which provided emergency employment opportunities to about 80,000 people right after the typhoon. It also, and this is quite interesting, provided a link for participants to the National Health and Employment Injury Insurance schemes. And maybe for this example, also to note what we learned from this application of the program was actually the importance of, first of all, coherence in the working conditions across the board, and also the wage level provided, making sure that people in affected areas are reached, and also to avoid any inequalities between different groups, so that you avoid, first of all, people moving from one region to another to be able to participate in a program, but also some people benefiting and others not. I think those are very important lessons. The second example, if we can go to the next slide, is from the wider region. This is the example of China. And this is a bit more moving towards the mitigation side as well. What we see and have seen for years in China is that human activity has been threatening China's forests, which are important to capture and store greenhouse gases, but they are also a barrier against soil erosion. And so this has led to the loss of this barrier. And at the same time, the country was also affected by several severe floods, also having to do with the decreasing forest size. And then we see green policies that were actually introduced included designated protected areas, included banning logging and other related activities in terms of forestry. And we saw quite severe social and economic consequences. Nearly 1 million people lost their jobs in this process due to these policies, and another 120 million rural residents were also affected in terms of their income sources. On the bright side, these programs actually managed to reforest about 27 million hectares of former farm and barren land. And additional measures were then introduced, actually. So we have, on the one hand, the Forest Conservation Program, which also supported local governments who received funds from the central government to help, first of all, state forest enterprises and the workers who were laid off from, for example, harvesting or processing jobs in the industry. There were jobs placement services for workers to transition into new jobs within the sector. And they created these forest protection units to actually create new jobs in the phase out of timber and then phase in of forest management. And outside the sector, there was also the Urban Employment and Reemployment Promotion Program, which provided subsidies to, for example, social insurance contributions, incentives for businesses to hire, and also for workers to undergo reemployment training. And existing labor force in state-owned enterprises was then enrolled in pension schemes for previously only the urban working population to provide additional assistance, and if and when those people retire, to actually have a pension. And then finally, we listed this on the slide as well, there was the Sloping Land Conversion Program, which provided support to other people not directly involved in the industry to make up for them foregoing crops or losing firewood, higher energy costs, etc. And initially, this was provided in the form of rice, actually, for each hectare of cropland that was repurposed. And later on, this was actually converted into cash, I think in 2004, and was very successful at converting farmland, so much that in the end, they actually changed it to refocus the activities on reforestation only. And the program was scheduled to end in 2007, but was then extended by about 8 years, and in total involved 124 million people in reforestation and conservation activities. We have one more example on the next slide, if you can continue. I won't say much about this one because Camilla actually has a quite interesting example from Spain, which she also wanted to introduce, but maybe just to say, in Paraguay, there is a slightly related interesting approach also for forest planting and reforestation that has just started, actually. And this is interesting because it's the first one that has been funded, the first project on social protection related activities that has been funded by the Green Climate Fund. So actually received climate funding, the Poverty, Reforestation, Energy, and Climate Change Project. And here, an interesting feature that I might want to mention quickly is the environmental CCT. So like a conditional cash transfer, essentially a bonus payment for involvement in forest planting and reforestation activities, and also supporting local households financially, helping them to diversify, etc. So I'm just going to hand it over to Camilla for the final example on Spain.
Thanks. If you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so here is to go back to some of the important points also that were made in the chat, that often employment losses and gains are localized and not necessarily coinciding in terms of the localities, and not necessarily, and from a temporal point of view, of course, there is a disconnect because the new jobs that are available might become available sometimes from now, but then the jobs are lost. So that there is really the need to manage that transition and to help people smoothen the impacts of that transition. So Let me say a couple of words on what happened in Spain's coal regions. So in Spain, coal mines were closed and are being closed. And of course, as in many countries in the world, coal regions are not very diversified. So the kind of social and employment impacts are quite deep for the communities. So there were a range of measures that were put in place. Some of them were more on the passive labor market side. Some were more related to active labor market policies and investments. But just to give you a couple of examples of instruments that were deployed. The first was providing workers that were about to lose their jobs with fixed and variable compensation for the voluntary termination of employment. This means that there was an element of fixed compensation for worker that wanted, accepted to leave the company, and one variable that depended on a number of years. The second option was early retirement. So for workers and miners that were towards the end of their working life, there were packages available to retire early and get them to their pension, plus in some cases some bonuses, some premiums. And then this was also accompanied by, as I was saying earlier, a number of other measures that are more on helping the people to access alternative job opportunities, including support for relocation, reskillings, and public employment and placement services that could help them to swiftly move into alternative incomes and livelihoods. So maybe I'll end this slide with saying, as you see, in some cases, as Christina was saying earlier, social protection is used as social protection. So there is not the need to come up with new programs and totally new approaches and so on. In some cases, as mentioned earlier, there are some changes and there are some innovative ways of providing social protection to deal with the climate change realities. But in a case like this, you actually have the leveraging of very well-known instruments of social protection that just need to be deployed or designed in a way so that they address the needs on the ground coming out from the transition. Thanks.
Thank you, Camilla. And then now we would just like to zoom in a little bit on the region and then Indonesia itself. If we can go to the next slide, we collected a few of the regional challenges, or mega trends and the respective implications for the region and Indonesia. So first of all, we know the population will continue to grow, including in Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country. We see the trend of urbanization continuing across the region. The urban population was in the majority for the first time in Indonesia in 2011, and preceded and also then accompanied by a slight but relatively steady decrease in the rural population. And so what we see in terms of demographics, these urbanization impacts on how people actually handle risks. So we see less community support, we see smaller families, but still, as I said, a dependency on natural resources in many cases. And also in terms of socioeconomic changes, we see that urbanization, the growing population, and also increasing wealth creates a greater demand for water, for energy, food and resources. And the rapid urban and industrial development has contributed to a decline in water quality and availability. And so as a third factor, we have COVID-19 now exacerbating existing socioeconomic challenges and inequalities as well, has affected food security quite significantly across the region, impacts on supply chains, and also resulted in a rise in food prices. And what we've also seen is that countries that have been affected by droughts and floods in the past, in Southeast Asia, for example, in 2018, 2019, have experienced exacerbated impacts of the pandemic on society. And I think this is quite significant to consider as well, that sometimes you see kind of different crises, different shocks affecting the overall situation and kind of compounding almost. Then we see obviously the current climate change impacts. You will be very familiar with those. So more frequent droughts, heat waves, floods. We obviously see also typhoons, tsunamis, related landslides, for example, as well. And we know that the World Bank ranked Indonesia specifically 12 among the 35 countries that face high mortality risks due to different kinds of hazards. And also the estimate that about 40% of Indonesia's population are currently at high risk of these kinds of hazards, and the number will definitely continue to go up. So in the future, what we may look at is Indonesia is predicted to experience a temperature increase of at least 0.8% by 2030. Food security and water availability will be heavily affected by that temperature increase. We'll see shorter growing seasons, unpredictable rainfall patterns, saltwater intrusion. And then obviously with these different rainfall patterns, we see so the rainy season ending earlier, the length of the overall season, rainy season becoming shorter. But we also see increased cyclone intensity across the country, exacerbated droughts on the southern islands, sea level rise effects in coastal areas. And so I want to stop it here because that's certainly a lot to take in. But we also see that by 2030, global climate change will have significant negative impacts on the economy of Indonesia as a whole. And so there are estimates around by 2100 that climate change impacts will cost an estimated 2.5 to 7% of GDP. So this is something to take into account, definitely. At the same time, on the emissions side, we see energy-related greenhouse gas emissions in the region going up. Indonesia is the 8th biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, coal making up about 65% of the energy mix. And Camilla, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but it's also the world's biggest coal exporter. And we see rising electricity demand and just need for affordable access to energy that needs to be balanced with a transition to a low carbon economy. And so looking at Indonesia's social protection landscape, if we can go to the next slide, we have existing social protection programs that essentially fulfill these core functions of social protection. We have social assistance in the form of conditional cash transfer and education cash transfer, food assistance, and quite a few others. We have labor market programs and worker protection schemes. I have the names written down here, but I'm not going to mispronounce them. We have social insurance programs as well. And so those all provide these basic functions. But in addition to the program level, we also have additional entry points. First of all, for like on the social protection policy level, labor market policies as well. And then, as we mentioned, green policies, strategies, and plans. For the adaptation side, there's quite an interesting process going on right now in Indonesia on adaptive social protection, which is one of Indonesia's national priorities as set out in the National Medium-Term Development Plan 2020-2024, and is part of the country's overall strategy to reform social protection. And so the Ministry of National Development Planning, Bappenas, is currently developing a so-called adaptive social protection roadmap, which is expected by the end of the year, which will provide some of the fundamentals for expanding social protection against, in the case of natural and climate-related risks and shocks, especially for people living in poverty and those who are particularly vulnerable. Some of the ASP milestones will look at, for example, expanding social protection to also cover people who are affected by a disaster, looking at the adaptiveness in regular program design to ensure quick disbursement, also looking at the integrated social welfare database to also integrate people in disaster-prone areas, looking at a presidential regulation on adaptive social protection, and also in the more medium to long term, looking at prevention aspects, so capacity building for communities, and rehabilitation and sustainable livelihoods. So I think this is quite an interesting development. I know there are probably one or two people in the audience who know this process a lot better than I do. So in the Q&A, I would kind of ask you to come in and say a few words about that. And just really quickly also on the mitigation and just transition side, at COP26, there are quite a few interesting developments in terms of agreements that are quite relevant also for the Indonesian context. One of the representatives from Indonesia who was at COP26 was Dr. Medrilzam from Bappenas, Director of Environmental Affairs. And he actually said, and I quote, because I thought this was quite an interesting statement, we see that just transition, this is not just about commitment or concepts. We would like to see how this can be implemented. When we say just transition in the context of our development and green economy programs and climate actions, we really expect that the just transition towards green economy will not just be just, but also fair and affordable. And so I think this sets the tone quite nicely. We also quickly consolidated a few of the COP26 agreements that you may also want to look at maybe after the lecture. We can go to the next slide. The first one that's quite interesting for you to consider is the Global Coal to Clean Power Transition Statement, which is part of the commitment to accelerate efforts towards the phase down. You see the formulation here that was initially phase out and it was changed to phase down of unabated coal power. So the Global Coal to Clean Power Transition Statement actually includes building clean new energy sources, power sources. Secondly, phasing out coal. Third, stop building new coal. And fourth, ensuring the coal phase out is a just transition. And so the Indonesian minister, Arifin, actually endorsed clauses 1, 2, and 4. So building clean, phasing out coal, and ensuring the just transition in the process. Indonesia signs up, and as part of the commitment to reach net zero by 2060 or sooner with international assistance, Indonesia will consider accelerating coal phase out into the 2040s, depending on also international financial and technical assistance. A second really important point is the political will to address subsidies. You see the formulation inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So it's, in a way, it needs to be defined more clearly at country level what inefficient versus efficient is. And subsidies worldwide actually account for 423 billion annually to subsidize fossil fuels for consumers. And UNDP at some point calculated that this is to pay for 3 times the annual amount needed to eradicate global extreme poverty. And that, I think, is quite an interesting statement. And then maybe also just one word on the Just Transition Declaration. This is the first time at these climate discussions that we see a definition of just transition included. We have it on the next slide, I think. So the process towards an environmentally sustainable economy, which needs to be well managed and contribute to the goals of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. And it also includes a reference to the importance of social protection. And so this declaration is actually committing countries to strategies that ensure that workers, businesses, and communities are supported as countries transition to greener economies. For now, it's about 30 nations, I believe, but numbers going up, and it's quite closely linked to the shift away from coal. And it also reflects the 2015 guidelines for a just transition that Camilla mentioned earlier. And so the ILO didn't just play a role in drafting this declaration, but also will support the implementation of it through the promotion and application of the international labor standards going forward. And finally, just a few more resources before we open up for discussion. We have on the next slide a few links to, you can go one more, a few links to side events at COP26 that might be interesting. So the first one was an event on the role of social protection in adaptation, and the second one more broadly on the just transition, also looking at mitigation aspects. And we launched, which was on the last slide, a social protection and climate change working group. So if you have experts at country level working on this topic, require more information, evidence, you can reach out through the website, which is on the slide, usp2030.org. There's a link to sign up for the working group, and you can get information and updates as well. So to close, I have 5 different key messages just to sum it up. First of all, as I said, social protection in its core functions provides protection against climate change related risks already. But, and this is number 2, risks will continue to increase in number, frequency, severity because of climate change. So we need to do more than we have and take climate change considerations into account when we formulate and implement social protection, but also labor market and green policy strategies and programs. Adaptation alone won't cut it, so we need to look at mitigation as well. It's the third one. Number 4, without social protection for all, green policies will leave some people behind, and so we won't necessarily see those as sustainable policies in the future. And at the same time, we will only reach significant coverage and universal social protection if we actually look at how to deal with these increased, intensified life cycle risks and manage to also more rapidly and basically anticipate the different risks that people face and be able to support people throughout them with systems that maintain their functionality throughout and also have financial sustainability. That's it for now. We also have a website on the topic if you want to take a look at this. And with that, I'll hand over to Ipe for the Q&A section, and also see we have a few more comments in the chat box, so maybe you can refer to them too. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Christina and Camila. I would like to welcome all the participants to this time raise your hands, and probably I could select some of you to speak up. And I would like to also particularly invite workers and employers, and probably I could kickstart my quick questions that we could probably address in this session. Do you think what would be the active roles of workers and employers in the policy development process? If you have any previous examples of or your views, that would be probably good insights to share. That's the first one. And the second one, it's not really a question from me, but I would like to put a little bit more on the focus on the social insurance side, the role of social insurance too. Some people tend to think about, the disaster response or the mitigation of risks, mitigation of impact, maybe the responsibility of the government, but actually the social insurance could also play a certain role. For instance, the extension of a duration of unemployment benefits in the certain affected regions by like typhoon or hurricanes. So is such action part of your conceptual framework? This is my second question. And I stop here for my question while waiting for others to come in. So the participants, please raise a hand while I'm asking questions. Thank you. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you. So for the first question, I know that Camila has a lot of experience in that regard, so I'll leave that to her. And I can respond specifically to the second question on the role of insurance, because there's actually a paper being developed by the ILO right now on that topic. So I'll say a few words about that in a moment. Over to you, Camila.
Yes, thanks for the question. A very important one for sure. So maybe let me say one point regarding just transition plans that we referred to very briefly earlier on. So just transition plans are these overarching planning instruments that bring together the action in different policy areas that are necessary for a certain countries or a certain region to ensure a just transition, depending on the sectors that are hardest hit, the groups that are hardest hit, and opportunities and risks. Now, these just transition plans need to be grounded on social dialogue, and that's what has been happening in just transition plans that have been started to be developed around the world. We have the case of Spain, for example, where the regions involved very active participations by representatives of workers and employers in the core regions. And we have the same, that is very clearly the case in South Africa. In South Africa, the just transition was one of the first countries actually starting to talk about just transition and to put policy measures in place, again, with the engagement of social partners. I think also in relation to specific policy instruments, like the ones we discussed for core regions, there the participation of workers and employees are key, because on the one hand you need it's a negotiation process that happens, you know, if we're defining what kind of unemployment measures you're going to put in place, what kind of conditions you have for early retirement, what kind of conditions you have for relocation. So there is a very clear role for employers, and it could be coal companies, it could be other employers in the regions, and for the trade unions, and they clearly played a fundamental role in there.
Thank you for your responses. Chris, I think you're raising your hand. Would you like to speak up, please?
Yes, thank you, Ipe. I would like to read out two questions from the YouTube channel. The first one is how ILO can make organizations by which climate and natural resources most affected for years to seriously work on curing climate and environmental issues or natural resources issues. And so I think the question is organization who you know who have negative who created negative impact to the climate and natural resources. And the second one is, does climate changes have a worse effect on female employers than male employees? Sorry, female employees than male employees? Thank you, Ipe. Back to you.
Back to the speakers.
Sure, I'll combine that with my feedback also on the role of social insurance. So I already mentioned in the presentation, right, the example of health insurance. So essentially, if you already are enrolled in a health insurance scheme before any kind of disaster happens, obviously, if something happens to you, the impact will be a lot less significant in terms of financial implications. Same with employees in injury insurance. And so I think that's a really important tool that is often forgotten, you know, in the chaos of any sudden onset event. And that's also why in the Philippines, there was such a focus of actually getting people who were temporarily employed through these public employment programs to actually link them up to existing health insurance and injury schemes, because they were in existence, but not many people in those affected regions were actually signed up beforehand. And so I think that kind of reiterates that, you know, whatever we do in the case of the sudden onset events, we also need to look at the sort of longer term protection of people, because it can help them throughout those difficult times as well. And then I think in terms of the just transition, we briefly mentioned the role of unemployment protection, unemployment insurance in that sense too, because we will see that it'll be a lot more common that people temporarily or also more long-term lose their jobs, especially in industries that are carbon intensive right now, and where those industries will be slowly phased out. And people will need support to also be able to re-enter the labor market eventually and be trained. And so I think that the link of having an unemployment insurance in place already now anticipating that these things will likely happen over the coming years, and also being, linking that already to training opportunities in these future forward-looking industries and kind of looking at skill sets for quote unquote green jobs. I think that is just, a very prudent thing to do already, because we know those things are going to happen. And there are also slightly more indirect linkages between social insurance and climate change more broadly. So if we look at how pension funds, for example, are invested, how the money is actually invested, to look at more green investments that can actually, those are large sums of money, right, internationally. And so that can also then be invested in more green sectors and companies as well. So there are quite a few linkages that may not be quite so obvious. And a paper on this will come out rather soon that was developed by the ILO as well. So just looking at the other questions, sorry to go back to this. So first of all, we had the questions on how ILO can make companies, in terms of negative impacts for who have been negatively impacting the environment for years, to work on climate and environmental issues. And I know Camilla has a few things to say about that. And then the other question, can you just repeat it? Because I know I had some ideas about it, but I got sidetracked.
Okay, the second question is, does climate change have a worse effect on female employees than male employees?
Yes, I wanted to say a few words about that one, because in other regions, we actually had a few studies on that. So in Latin America, there was an ILO report published jointly with IDB, and it looked specifically at the impacts of climate change and the overall just transition on employment, but specifically also gender aspects of it. And so I think what was quite interesting to see was that these industries are often very male dominated, especially in Latin American countries. And so what the conclusion there was that it's already difficult for women to find jobs in these sectors and to also, be part of respective training, etc. And so in this transition, it'll potentially be even more difficult. There is also the aspect of part-time work that will potentially also make it more difficult for people to reskill and to actually reposition themselves in the labor market. And then also the question of, how flexible women actually are in terms of moving from A to B to actually start a new job in a new, potentially green job as well. And so I think all of these aspects potentially impact women in a different way than men. That doesn't mean that this is the case across the board, but we've definitely seen examples of this in the past. And maybe also just one additional example from the garment sector, which is predominantly female in some Southeast Asian countries. We also see that there are major changes in the way the garment sector functions, changes in demand. People are looking for more sustainable clothing, etc. And so we will probably also see very significant impacts on a decrease in employment in those sectors and people having to, reorient themselves. And those are predominantly female jobs right now. And so I think these are just some of the examples to what extent, a transition is not necessarily gender neutral. Handing over to Camilla because she may have something to add. And I know she also has some answers on the other question.
Thanks. Perhaps a couple of points in relation to what's the ILO role in ensuring that certain carbon intensive enterprises or sector moves to a greener, to a lower impact. So I would say, I want to be provocative here, and I'm going to say that I don't think it's the ILO's role in just pushing companies to go greener, right? I mean, I think our role is to promote the shift as it relates to decent work. So, for example, if you can, and I think it's important for the ILO to make the case of the opportunities and the potential impacts that you have in shifting your business model to a greener business model. So if I give you an example of the work that we were doing with small and medium enterprises, for example, for instance, there we tried to have an integrated approach in helping the enterprises improve their triple bottom line. So on the one hand, their environmental performance, but also their competitiveness and the working conditions for their employees. And we were using a model of bipartite collaboration. So if you advance sustainability as a package, so in a way that also advances the ILO mandate, I think there's a clear role. And I think it's sometimes easier to convince businesses going greener if you're also linking them up with improvement in economic performance, competitiveness, and so on. At the same time, if you ask me, I don't think we should be in the business of just promoting environmental sustainability as such, because there are other organizations that are doing that and are better placed. So it could be UN Environment, it could be UNIDO that are focused on very technology-based solutions to improving the environmental footprint of companies. So I think for us, the idea is really to work in an integrated approach where we link the environmental and the decent work agenda. The second element is that I think there is a very important questions on the role of, what's going to happen in terms of subsidies and what's going to happen, what's the role of pension funds and investment. So I think actually on subsidies, it's too early to say what the COP commitments are going to really translate into. But there have been examples in different countries on the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. I'm not saying it has been easier. I'm also not saying that it was always done in a good way. But at the same time, I think we are going to see some of those reforms taking place in the future. It's just a matter of how they are designed, because if they are designed in a way that takes into account of the potential social consequences, you might not face this resistance that you have faced when the reforms were very top down and very blind to the potentially social negative impacts that they could have. So I still think that there is a space for that, and we are going to see some of that. But at the same time, it would be important to, if we can, to have a role in shaping those measures so that they are socially progressive. The second point is on pension funds. Definitely, I think there is a big trend towards investment. I mean, what is usually talked about is this transition down, which is, less money likely to go into fossil fuel-based industries, more money going into the green industries, and then what happens in terms of companies that will be restructuring, so changing their business models to shift more toward greener products and services. I think we're going to see some of that. The time frame remains to be seen. What's important, I would say, is two things. On the transition down, it's important that it's not abrupt, right? Because you don't want to leave communities and workers stranded. So it needs to be something that is planned for. And I think it's also important to engage with companies as they go about their restructuring, because their change in business models can be done in a better or worse way in terms of employees, lays off, and there are many models that foster re-employment, redeployment, reskilling, and so on, and help retention. And on the other hand, on the investment so the increased flow of money into the renewable energy section, again, I think it's important to look at the conditionalities and to see how we can ensure labor rights and quality jobs that are tied to these new emerging industries and the capital flows that are supporting them.
I just have a few points to add, because I also saw the comments in the chat actually on that we are on track for a predicted 2.7 degree increase by 2100, which would be disastrous, and that is certainly correct. I just wanted to kind of add, before COP26, we were definitely on course for about 2.7 degrees. if we take into account these new announcements, we are more on a path between 1.8 and 2.4. And obviously that would assume that all the different commitments that were made would actually be implemented. And parties have already agreed to revisit their commitments as necessary by the end of next year to still put us on track for 1.5, the upper end of the ambition under the Paris Agreement. Now, I think what's important to consider, even if, you know, we will probably more be on the upper end of this spectrum, is that, I mean, technically these COP agreements, and I saw the comments in the chat as well, that, you know, our attempts can only dovetail the agreement consensus we obtained from high-level meetings such as COP. But I think it might actually be the other way around, that COP often actually reflects discussions that are already ongoing in countries at country level, and that actually reflect, for example, that we have been talking about subsidies for some time and that there is now political will at a higher level, and that we have been talking about coal phase out or phase down for quite some time. This is a topic also in Indonesia. And so I think this is kind of now reflected at international level. And so I think it's important to look at it that way, that it wouldn't be certainly these kind of small interventions at country level dovetail the agreement, but oftentimes that's kind of what drives these agreements at international level as well. I also saw in the chat that Dominic Sett actually commented on the ASP roadmap, and I know that he has a few more details on that. So I'm just wondering if he might want to speak up and say a few words about the process, where it stands right now. Raise your hand, Dominic, if you're there and you want to say a few things. Yes, he's there.
Hey, yes, I'm there. Don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, basically, just as I mentioned in the chat, I think, so when we look at the roadmap in Indonesia, I think it's quite important to mention that it's, we're trying to use a very holistic approach. So not only looking at assistance schemes, but really trying to also use different social protection schemes, from insurance to assistance, but then not only looking at programs, but then also looking at data, for example. I mean, within this effort of coming up with this roadmap, we also conducted a risk assessment where we also try to look not only at risks that we usually consider, for example, in the DRM and CCA sector, but that we also look at impacts on different societal groups. So on informal workers, for example, specifically also on women, and really try to see what are different impacts and how can they actually then be incorporated in such assessments. Yeah, and I think that this is really the effort of again, really looking at a more holistic approach to really combine different efforts in order to then strengthen, well, basically the resilience of different households. Yeah, yes, that's all. But I'm also more than happy to answer any questions. So I'm happy to also post my email in the chat. And yeah, if there are any other additional questions, then feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks so much. Sounds good. Ipe, over to you. I think there's still a question on green jobs that I'm sure Camilla would have a few words to say, but let us know if we still have time.
Yes, okay. I think we are almost running out of time, but I think we have 3 remaining questions for, I think one for Camilla and the others for Christina to close. Okay, the first question, to what extent do you think we can replace non-green jobs by greener ones? This is probably for Camilla, I guess, but if you would like to respond, Christina, you are also welcome. And the second question, any implications for the increasing gig economy workers from, you know, climate change perspectives? This is quite a kind of interesting questions, how it is related, but it can probably be, you know, more wider topic, how to extend social insurance coverage to those gig economy workers. But if you have any insights, your insights are welcome. The last question is, could countries build upon the policy responses to COVID-19 crisis to ensure just transition toward low carbon economy? Or do you see the challenges of maintaining these policies in the long run. So quite diverse questions, but over to you. Either of you could start. These are last questions to close.
Perhaps I'll start, and then Christina, you could wrap up. So on the points on jobs and whether we can replace the jobs with alternative green jobs. So there's two things to bear in mind. One, I think, is that we need to anticipate and understand the impacts of the transition and where employment losses might reside in terms of locations, in terms of sectors, in terms of types of workers affected, skill levels, and so on. And then we need to map out what are the potential opportunities for new jobs, new green jobs to be created. Again, differentiating between among locations, skill levels, and so forth. I think it's very country specific. So going back to the point made by Christina earlier, it is, let's say, the international level and the national level often work in tandem, and they're quite interconnected. Sometimes an international pledge can push a little bit of more ambition at the domestic level, but it's not that it generally doesn't come out of the blue, right? Then there are a lot of the negotiations and debates and so on that happen at the country level. So I would say these two things really have to come together. But the second point is that these realizing these green jobs opportunities need to be based really in the realities of the local economy and the labor markets, because there will be different types of opportunities in different sectors and in different localities depending on the structure of the economies. And for some, it might be the highest potential is renewable. For others, it might be sustainable agriculture or tourism, sustainable tourism, and so on. So it really needs to be based on the ground. And I'll just perhaps close, and I'm sure Christina will have more to add on the question on the green recovery, let's say. So it is an unprecedented opportunity, is what we have on designing, a better new normal, as is often referred to. I think the crisis has brought home the kind of impact that we have on global change and how interconnected we all are. And in many ways, it resembles the kind of deep impact that climate change could have, and how the most vulnerable could be the worst hit. A second, I think, important reminder is the importance of social protection, because at the time of crisis, that's what really is able to keep people on their feet and to protect them from being left stranded in the crisis. So I think we have really a great opportunity, and these considerations can feed into the design of recovery policies that build a fairer society and more sustainable economies, also including with investing in greener and sustainable sectors. The extent to which that's happening it varies. I think there are some promising developments, but there are also some kind of business as usual. So I think we need to keep pushing. I think you all know that there is a global call to action at the ILO that is really focusing on trying to make sure the recovery is human-centered and sustainable. The hope is that we can keep on working and make sure that those opportunities are not lost.
Thanks, Camilla. Yeah, I have quite a few comments to add on that one too, but maybe just a brief tangent on the gig economy. I mean, I think that the connection is pretty vague, but I do think when we look at all of these impacts that we discussed and the process of adaptation and mitigation that is necessary, what we do see is that it'll probably make it even more challenging to help formalize jobs, because a lot of the jobs that we may lose in the process are actually relatively formal jobs with certain types of benefits, for example, in the coal industry. And so I do think, that the issues that come with the gig economy, so very precarious contracts, very much short-term bases, looking also at missing benefits, etc. I think that will be issues that we will see in the transition more and more. And so it's even more important to consider how we can continue to move from informal to formal jobs throughout this process. and also look at how to actually connect a very broad part of the population, and ideally progressively towards universality, irrespective of your job as well, right? Because people need to have access to social protection benefits in all different kinds of situations, including with employment in the gig economy. And so I do think we can kind of get two birds with one stone in that sense, because people will face all different kinds of risks going forward. And so I think that just makes the case even more compelling. In terms of what we can learn from the kind of response to COVID-19 and also how the recovery will look like and how we can use it. What we've seen with the response to COVID-19 also in terms of social protection is that rapid social protection measures were taken across the board in pretty much all countries, which is very impressive. We managed to recognize coverage gaps very quickly. So where there is a will, there's a way. I think this is exemplified by the response that we've seen across the board. What was interesting was the innovations in the mechanisms that were used to deliver quickly. And that is certainly something that we can build on also in the way we approach climate-related risks. There was quite a diversity in terms of the scale and the nature of the responses, but that also doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It's essentially coming at the problem from different angles. And so I do think now, looking at the recovery, we can take a lot of lessons from these mechanisms, how financing was activated very quickly, and how political processes were actually set in motion in that direction. And maybe just to add as well, there was a policy brief published by the Secretary General rather recently on jobs, the role of jobs in social protection as part of the recovery from COVID-19. And I think that is quite an interesting document. I can also link that document in the chat so you can take a look at it afterwards, because it also refers to the greening of jobs in the process and a lot of the potential that we've been talking about of social protection in this process as well, both as it relates to climate change adaptation and also mitigation. And so that one, I will just put that in the chat real quick as well for you to take a look at. And otherwise I'll hand over to Ipe because I know we need to close. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christina and Camila. Again, I don't have any final words to close. I think probably you presented probably sufficiently. And Christina also posted in the chat box the key URL, and you could, the participant, you could always, Google social protection lectures, ILO Jakarta, then you could reach all the presentation materials and the recordings. And thank you very much again for Christina and Camila to present, and also thank you for excellent interpretation, Wenny. And I would like to close this session, and thanks for your participation, colleagues. And sorry, very last words, we have feedback forms out when you log out, so please do so. We will consider the topics and the feedbacks you want in the next sessions. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.